Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
One thing I learned when I came to live in Australia, 12 years this week, was, and remember, it was a lot colder then, whatever you're telling me, 12 years ago. When we arrived, we felt cold. We'd left a northern hemisphere summer to come to a southern hemisphere winter. And although the degrees centigrade didn't look any different, it was different, especially at night. But there's one thing I have learned, and forgetting all the fact that things are changing and it might be a little warmer, winds make such a difference to our experience of the weather. Now, in Matthew's gospel here, the disciples were certainly facing and having to overcome what I might call a contrary to wind, something that's against them, something that's making life a little difficult, to say the least. They faced a fiercely opposing wind as they crossed the Sea of Galilee. But before we look at the incident itself, let's put it into its context. In this central section of Matthew's Gospel, for basically 3 chapters, we can explore it together by seeing, first of all, we've got a concentration of parables in chapter 13. It's a chapter full of parables of the kingdom. We have the feeding of the crowd and how Jesus was not willing to send them away, but he fed the crowd from those loaves and fishes, so small that they were. And in this account that we look at in Matthew 14, 22 to 33, we have a passage that's not unique to Matthew, but has some very important, unique facets in the Matthew's telling of this account. Now, we remind ourselves that Jesus refused to send the crowd away in that preceding moment to the feeding of the crowd. He refused to send them away. He fed them. They'd been with him, listening to him teach. Perhaps they'd been with him many hours, and he refused to send them away. Well, here's an instance where he did send them away. So you hold those two things up and say, he refused to do it then, now he's prepared to do it, to send those disciples on their way and to send the crowds away too. An occasion that shows him dismissing, tells us he dismissed the crowd. It's almost like we've come to a close now of this moment. Certainly, we know what it is when a headmaster in a school dismisses us. Or we know what it is when at the close of a worship there's a dismissal, a scattering into the world to do whatever it is when we leave that particular place. There are many things we could say about this passage as we look at it tonight. But it seems to me that we shall touch on some of them, important as they are. But for me, I think it tells me something about what was happening in the life of the early church. You say that's a strange thing to say. Well, no, not really. It becomes a very important passage because they are experiencing storms. They're experiencing things that are happening to them that they could never have planned. And that's the one thing about this storm. Inland lakes, or particularly seas that have mountainsides by the side, experience this kind of thing. Something that comes out of nowhere. Something that you're ill prepared for and you suddenly have to face. And that, I think, is important about the Sea of Galilee. On this harp-like shaped lake, suddenly these disciples who've been sent on their way, we're told that they're a considerable distance from the shore, and the wind comes, and it becomes a very disturbing experience. Some people have tried to argue that this passage is really a post-resurrection passage. I'm not happy with that description because I see it from a different perspective. I think this is one of the great teaching moments for Peter and the rest of the disciples in their story. And whilst it's true that the resurrection would help them to understand the risen Lord more fully, only in these kind of experiences are they growing in their understanding of Jesus. There's also something very interesting about the two stories. That's the feeding of the crowd and the walking on the water. And both of them have an Old Testament kind of illusion, don't they? Because there's a real sense in which Jesus fed the children of God when they were in the wilderness. They knew what it was to be led by fire and to be fed as they went on their way. So feeding is very important. And God feeds his people. And then there's the lake. Jesus took, you remember, the children of Israel through the water. And water comes alive again in this passage as Jesus walks on the water. So I offer you three aspects that I think are there. I don't see the stories as two woven together. I think it's one account of something very, very important. A storm and Jesus walking on the water. First of all, there are times to be alone. All of us know that. Some of us are better at it than others. In verse 23, it tells us, after he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. There are times in which being alone is important. It has been said, those people who can be alone are better with others. Very much because of the aloneness with God. And the aloneness with God is very real. It's the nurturing of a spirituality. It's something very, very important. There's no difficulty in Jesus dismissing this crowd. But a close examination of the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and John, which tell this story, explain why things happened in the way they did. Jesus sent the disciples on ahead of him. This wasn't the first time he'd done that, and it won't be the last. They have to do something. They have to meet him. They have to go somewhere. Because he needs to be alone to pray. And if Jesus needs to be alone to pray, then you do. And I do. There are moments of aloneness that are important. Mark proposes that he needed a distance between himself and the crowds. The crowds were pressing on Jesus from the very beginning of Mark's gospel. It could be contended that the strength of the Christian faith depends on our ability to handle aloneness. I mean by that we gain strength through the Spirit of God, through our willingness to be nurtured by him in those difficult places. It's really only a couple of months ago that I stood on the mountains that surround Lake Galilee. Mountains are very, very powerful images of God's work. Just think of the scriptures for a moment. God gave the law through Moses on a mountain. The mountain was important. There was that revelation to the inner group of disciples on a mountainside. It was on a mountain where Jesus agonized for his people. And it will be on a mountain where he sends them, go into all the world. So mountains are very, very important. And Jesus goes on the mountainside to be alone, to pray. But there is another reason why that mountain is important. It gave him perspective to see the boat. If he'd been at the bottom, he may not have seen the disciples on the boat and them struggling in the storm. But from the mountainside, it was a vista he could not miss because it was the chosen way that he was about. For many years, I had responsibility for Christian leaders. And in that time, I had a minister, and I share his story. He would not mind me sharing this story with you. And he had a ministry that went through some very difficult times. He reached a moment of crisis in his life. In the midst of the crisis, he lost his wife and family. He was really at the end of himself. It was a most distressing time for him. And he had some sabbatical time that was available to him. So in conversation, he decided he wanted to go to the Holy Land. And he wanted to go to a place where he could really find aloneness. And he wasn't by nature an alone kind of person. He was a person who enjoyed the company of others. He was somebody who would lead the conversation. He was somebody who enjoyed it. He said, I need to be alone. So he chose to go. And he went to a Greek convent on the Mount of Temptation. And let me tell you about this particular place. It's above Jericho. The name of the monastery is Coruntal, Latin for 40 days. You can see why the Mount of Temptation is there. And I remember seeing it for the very first time from the car park in Jericho. And going to Jericho and standing in the car park, and I told this once before here, talking about grapes, I saw the biggest bunch of grapes I've ever seen from here to the ground. You can see all those lovely images, can't you, of the bunches of grape that they saw in that land that God was promising. But you know, I looked up, and cut into the mountainside is this convent. And the only way to get up to it is to be lifted up to it, when you get right up to the sheer height. And so my minister friend went there and then was taken a few miles away from the convent and slept for 40 days and nights under the stars. He was given enough food and water and drink to be able to survive. And he said he had never experienced, I remember him describing it to me. He said he had never heard the silence as loud as it was there. No noise, no people to interrupt the silence. Occasionally he would hear at a very great distance the women in the convent singing. But he was alone, nobody was with him. But it was a very, very important time. We all need times of refreshment and renewal. Times to be alone with God. Now, it's different for all of us how that's going to work out. Not all of us would be wanting to go and experience silence in that way. Some people, I remember a bishop friend of mine who, when I was a young minister, he was an Anglican bishop, and Bishop Kenneth. And Bishop Kenneth was very greatly helpful to me. He prayed with me from time to time, and I come to appreciate him because he was outside of my own tradition. And he chose, when he retired, he was not married, he chose to go and live in a place of silence. And he only was allowed to write 2 or 3 letters or cards by choice as a discipline. So when I was ordained, it was such a joy to get a card from him, because I knew the card meant something, because he had so little opportunity to write. Now, as you can imagine, my wife would say, yeah, you're dead right. I don't think I'd cope with that very easily. I wonder if you would. I think it's a real challenge, you know, to be in that place. No singing. That'd be trouble for some of us, wouldn't it? No singing. No music. Just silence and refreshment and renewal. Jesus needed those moments. And he went onto a mountainside, a powerful emphasis of solitude, a very important place for him to go. And from that, he's able to see the disciples in distress. And is it symbolic that sometimes at the place of spiritual refreshment and renewal, we are able to see distress that we cannot see any other way? And I don't just mean physically. Because we've chosen to go to that place of renewal and refreshment, so we're able to perceive. So we're able to see need in a new and rather wonderful way. Could it be that prayer and devotion gives us a unique vantage point for the world to really help people? It's healthy to have a distance between ourselves and the challenges that we face. Prayer provides us with the spiritual perspective when we're facing need that might easily overwhelm us. And I have to be very careful how I articulate this, but we could say that we see beyond our own limited perspective and see things, as it were, from God's perspective. You know, Mother Teresa on one occasion was asked, when you're praying, what do you say to God? And the dear lady responded, said, well, I don't say anything. I just listen. So the journalist was a little irritated by that answer, took it a bit. And what does God say to you? And she smiled with that smile that belongs, I think, to the holiness that us Protestants have to acknowledge. She said, well, he doesn't say anything, he just listens to me. And she said, and if I've got to explain that to you, it's going to be very difficult. And I think that what she was driving at is that there are places that in that solitude where both ourselves and God are able to meet each other in a very, very real way. So there are times to be alone. Secondly, the storms of life can distress. There's no doubt about that. We read in verse 24, and the boat was considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. In verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. There are two essential features about this storm. One is the nature of the storm itself, and the other is it's a storm at night. It's a storm at night because he comes walking just before dawn. And if you can understand this, I think the dark feels the darkest just before dawn, before any light has pierced it. In that darkness, the storm is very real. Now, we've got to remind ourselves, these are fishermen. Some of them had earned their living here. This is what they earned their bread and butter from. So if they're frightened and fearful in a storm, then it has to be a storm. It's not a little bit of wind. It's not a bit of buffeting. It's something real against the boat. And they're fearful in that moment. And of course, Galilee, like so many lakes, is susceptible to these storms. If tonight we were to say, what have been the storms of our lives? And I'm not just talking about water, the things that have happened to us, that have disturbed us, the things that have come to us in life that we never expected, then very often you don't get them prepared for them. They just come from nowhere. The things that happen that really rock your life. How many people have lost loved ones and never known a thing about it when it happens? How many people have, and when I think now of my own ministry, I can remember knocking on the door of a young woman, only in ministry a very short period of time, and having to tell her that her husband, who she was expecting home at 6 o'clock, was not coming home. And how many people have to face those kind of traumas? And if we haven't faced them, and it's quite possible that many of us may sit here and say, oh, well, I've never had an experience of like that. I'm just going to say this, just hang around a bit longer, because life is not predictable and things come. We have to be ready for the storms of living in the stormy places, because they can cause great distress. Just as nature can serve a contrary wind, so life can bring about in experiences and moments that are unplanned for. Experiences of pain and sorrow can come without you planning it, but it invades. Where the wind came from, you'll never know, but you know that it came. The experience of the disciples brings terror. In fact, if you can imagine this story being read in the early church, can you imagine many of them saying, we didn't expect Jerusalem to be in turmoil like this, and many of us to lose so much of the things we had to make us what we are. The church in Jerusalem in the very earliest days had to go about asking for money from other places. Places like Philippi and other churches had to send money to sustain the church. Because that place that you might have expected to be of all places soon became a very poor church, because suffering started to invade their lives. And so it has been that it's knocked on the door of many a person. The disciples' terror is real, particularly of the fact that only recently they'd seen Jesus feeding the crowd. But their trembling hands now are not reaching out for bread, but reaching out for help. The storms of life can cause distress. As I indicated earlier, one of the issues we deal with when we turn to the Gospels is, what is it really telling us about that early Christian community? Michael Green, who's written as well as anybody, I think, about the Acts of the Apostles and the nature of evangelism in the life of the early church, writes in this way. It's not possible to question the value of the story when he writes a commentary on Matthew. It was a pattern both of unbelief and of faith, but storms often beset them and fear chilled them. So in fact, this story is not just about storm, it's about faith. And it's about belief and unbelief. And what it's like to be in the middle of all that and find yourself rocking about. And of course, Green continues. Then, of course, they would begin to sink until they all cried out to the Son of God for his powerful hand to snatch them and hold them up. You never know where it's coming from. Let me tell you a true story. It's not in any script, but as you know, we've just returned just a matter of a few weeks ago from a break that included 2 weeks in Israel. And we went to Bethsaida, and I'd done the face-to-face to camera that I was meant to do. So then my director said, all I want you to do now is just walk up the road and just look either side. And that was fine. Until a big black asp came from behind a rock. Now, we had a Jewish person that was with us. He's called a fixer, in that he arranges things, and when things get problematical, he helps you through those moments. And he said to us after, it's one of the most venomous snakes in the Middle East. And I was really delighted about this experience. I think if I'd known it was there, I wouldn't have walked that way. If I'd known it was there, I would have chosen another pathway. If you and I know what's going to happen to us in life, we might choose for it to be different. Not always, because some of the bad experiences of life have some wonderful things that God uses through them. But you can't know. The storm comes from nowhere, and it causes enormous distress. And the terror of the disciples is because they misunderstand. They think Jesus is a ghost. So their experience of what's going on, they misunderstand. When I think of periods of distress and the storms of life, I think of one pastoral story that I will guarantee that I'll never forget. I may forget many things, but I'll never forget this experience. Hearing late one night, living on the North Wales coast, where we had, on a peninsula, where we had two beach fronts. One was where all the holidaymakers went. It was very calm and a beautiful beach area, and people went to by the thousands. The other side had more storms hit it. It also had sandbanks. And late one Saturday evening, the news came that a father and his son were on the sandbanks. And he was there. And I have to tell you, only he came back. His little boy did not. And I sat with Dad, and he talked, and he said the most painful thing was he could hear his son crying out for help, but was not able to get to him. There's enormous distress when storms come, when things that we never could have anticipated happen in our lives. The storms of life do indeed hit us, but for the person and for the life grounded in Jesus Christ, absolutely clear that this is the master of the waves, this is the one who holds us firm, can bring us through those moments. And if you're at that place tonight, this is the gospel word for you. My Savior is able to save you. He's able to lift you. He's able to keep you. He's able to guide you. And he will never, never, never be someone who cannot reach out to you to save. But thirdly, Jesus Christ is the Lord of the wind and the waves. He's the one that can keep us secure. This passage is full of vivid imagery. If you took time to see it, you'll see how much imagery there is here about fear. The picture of the disciples sent on their own way across troubled seas, and Jesus walking on the water to save them, has spoken to Christians in every generation. Many people, when they've read that Bible passage for the first time, have seen in it things that can sustain them in their own lives. Some people have struggled with the nature miracles, especially since the Enlightenment. But I think they have a great deal to say to us about what God is like and his sustaining power. Fear is the recurring theme. I jotted down when I was looking at this: terrified, cried out in fear, do not be afraid, became frightened, all in the space of about 11 verses. So there is no doubt what this passage is all about. I'm certain that if we were to use the word fear, and we were to talk amongst ourselves and say, where does fear sit in your life? All of us would have some things that we're fearful about. And if this New Testament story were a Greek tragedy, you know that in the Greek tragedy they used to wear masks. If it were a Greek tragedy, I want to tell you there's at least 3 major scenes. There's the sheer terror, the mass that would come as the disciples see Jesus walking toward them, not recognizing him. the mask of sheer terror. Secondly, that there may be the fear that Peter has. Because I'm certain that when Peter gets onto that water, when Peter knows what it is to go towards Jesus, he may well be going because Jesus has asked him, but that doesn't mean to say he's got no fear. And then there's the third mask. And the third mask to me is the mask of distraction. As Peter knows what it is to be going towards him and finding himself sinking. Many of us have heard preachers talk about when he took his eyes off Jesus, so he knew what it was to sink in the water. Well, I think it's about distraction. And distraction can come in all our lives. And in the midst of fear, the one thing you don't want is to be distracted from the only person who can sustain you. How many characters are there in the story? Asked one preacher one night. It was a trick question. Because, of course, there are all the disciples there. He said, only 3. And, of course, they looked at him and thought, our preacher can't count. Only 3. There is Jesus who speaks and acts. There is Peter who speaks and acts. And there are the disciples who speak and act as one. William Willimon, great preacher of today in contemporary in North America, put it best in a sermon that he preached on this particular passage. He called his sermon, How Will You Know It's Jesus? If Peter hadn't ventured forth, he said, had not obeyed the call to walk on the water, then Peter would never have had this great opportunity of recognizing Jesus and being rescued by him. I wonder if too many of us are merely splashing about in the safe shallows and therefore have too few opportunities to test and deepen our faith. The story today implies that if you want to be close to Jesus, you have to venture forth on a sea. You have to prove his promises through trusting his promises, through risk and venture. Clifton Kirkpatrick concluded, getting out of the boat and onto the water is the most risky, the most exciting, and the most fulfilling way to live your life. And in this encounter in Matthew's Gospel, he invites not just Peter, but you to do whatever it is in your life that demands you get on that water. And you walk for Jesus. And you put your hand into the hand of the Savior. Amen.